Red Bull will officially decide its 2025 F1 driver lineups after the season finale in Abu Dhabi, but its plan has already become clear. Despite Sergio Perez's insistence he will remain Max Verstappen's teammate next year, the reality has not been anywhere near so definitive for several months. Ever since Red Bull seriously considered dropping him in the summer break, Perez's position has been precarious. With just one race left in 2024, team boss Christian Horner has admitted to us that Red Bull will weigh up its options after Abu Dhabi and still needs to understand what the path is with Sergio. That doesn't sound like a driver who's nailed on to keep his seat, because he isn't. In fact, our understanding is that Red Bull intends to go in the other direction, and it's now more a matter of how to manage Perez's exit plus finalise who replaces him, although a clear leading candidate has emerged there. Perez is in a bad run of form so deep it's more like a permanent downturn. The last 2 seasons followed a familiar pattern: start pretty well, fade and come back stronger. But while Perez has previously pulled himself out of his Red Bull spirals with strong individual weekends, there's no evidence of him doing that this time. With the notable exception of Baku in September, he's barely shown a hint of replicating his early season podium scoring form at all since April. Even his front row start at Spa before the summer break turned into finishing last in class among the top 4 teams. Perez is not the type to give in and unsurprisingly remains defiant, but he looks and sounds like he has no answers. His problems are always blamed on vague car issues or discomfort or unfulfilled promise or poorly executed sessions. Given how much Verstappen has complained about the Red Bull and the fact there have been times they have both reported similar limitations, there's obviously an element of Perez simply not being able to work around the problems like Max can. Verstappen's father Jos has even hinted as part of his semi-regular Red Bull criticism that if the team could produce a less challenging car, he'd back Perez to be closer to the front again. There is almost certainly some truth to that, but it doesn't explain the extent of the gaps or the disappointments. There have been far too many Q1 exits and paltry points in a car that has kept fighting for podiums and wins in Verstappen's hands. It may be that Perez has simply been exposed by the extent of the competition now. He's not as fast as Verstappen, so there might be a couple of temps or more there. He's also not as comfortable in the car, so there's another 2 or 3 temps, and the rest, when it gets that bad, may just be him being devoid of confidence or overdriving. Qatar, for example, went from the embarrassment of being overtaken by Franco Colapinto at the pit exit in the sprint to a Grand Prix that was looking decent on the surface, except he was over a second a lap slower than Verstappen on average and had fallen miles behind, then spun behind the safety car, burned the clutch recovering and retired. Perez has cost the team the Constructors' Championship despite Verstappen winning another driver's title. The Qatar race was already showing once again that even his better days now are not at the required level, and the fact he exited it so limply with a rubbish mistake meant it didn't end up one of his better days anyway. We've known for a while that Red Bull privately believed the best scenario was Perez recognising this is the end and retiring. That could avoid a very costly payoff and keep him involved with Red Bull as a brand. Horner finally hinted at this in Qatar. He said he'd let Perez come to his own conclusions and nobody's forcing him one way or another. It's unlikely Perez is going to take his exit lying down, and who can blame him? He has a life to manage after F1, and if he has a contract, he should be compensated. But Horner said he's old enough and wise enough to know what the situation is, which means even if Red Bull's not forcing Perez's hand right now, it will if it has to. Aside from working out how to manage Perez's exit, Red Bull is zeroing in on the solution: Liam Lawson. Perez was only ever meant to be a short-term fix for Red Bull's driver problems after Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon had struggled across 2019 and 2020. But his stay has been extended to 4 years already by solid enough performances during the peak of its domination and the fact there has been a lack of a clear-cut alternative. Now Lawson's latest cameo in Red Bull's second team seems to have mostly convinced Red Bull he is worth putting in alongside Verstappen. It's been a long road to this point for Lawson. He stepped in last year in place of the injured Daniel Ricciardo in the second RB team and did well, but a combination of Red Bull's lingering interest in the Ricciardo experiment plus Honda's backing of Yuki Tsunoda meant there was no full-time drive available for 24. He's had a second chance in the final part of this season though. Ricciardo was dumped because he was not deemed consistently good enough anymore to be a real candidate to partner Verstappen again. Lawson came in and immediately got to more or less the level that Ricciardo looked like he was at most of the time against Tsunoda, sometimes a little quicker, sometimes a little slower. Lawson's raced well, scored points and been combative in battle. He lacks experience, there is a little doubt over his ultimate speed, and he has made mistakes, like his needless spin in Qatar. But Red Bull is accepting of this and doesn't seem too bothered by his occasional qualifying deficit to Tsunoda or the fact he has struggled to beat him in races. As we'll come to shortly, Red Bull acknowledges Tsunoda is very quick, so if Lawson can compete well with a fast driver who is much more experienced than he is and has a lot of other compelling attributes himself, that bodes well. Red Bull seems to believe that Lawson is at least quick enough to be a stronger driver than Perez in qualifying, and then he should build on that as he gets more experience. He's also very confident and doesn't seem to get easily rattled in the Red Bull environment. That mental robustness is a coveted asset, so while Lawson doesn't tick every box, he gives Red Bull some optimism that he would do a better job than what Perez has done. Ultimately, there still has to be a concern over whether Lawson is good enough to support a World Championship bid on the driver front and the constructors front. And of course, just because he's an upgrade on Perez doesn't mean a top team with championship ambitions should be turning to a driver who would only have 11 starts under his belt by the start of 2025.
Travelling should be exciting and fun, but it's no fun at all if you can't use your phone properly while you're away. This is what happens to me when I go to a flyaway Formula 1 race outside of Europe, somewhere like Las Vegas or one of the Grand Prix in the Middle East. I have to switch my mobile data off before I land, otherwise I'm going to get stung with some horrendous roaming charges just for doing my job. I can't send messages, I can't WhatsApp my family, I can't keep in touch with my colleagues at the race while on the move. That's where the Saily eSIM comes in. If you're travelling to races, it's a game changer. It's much cheaper than adding a roaming plan to your phone contract, and it means you can use your phone for all those essential things while you're away. Just download the Saily app, set up your account, pick your data plan, Saily covers hundreds of different countries, and away you go. No rip-off roaming charges, no need to buy an expensive local SIM card at the airport, no need to worry about finding stable Wi-Fi wherever you go. Scan this QR code to download the Saily app and apply the code RACE at checkout to get 15% off. So that's peace of mind and total coverage for even less while you're away.
Going with Lawson would mean rejecting Tsunoda, but it shouldn't be a surprise because there has been resistance to giving Tsunoda a chance for a long time, and barring an unexpected U-turn, that's not about to change. Tsunoda has been asked about his Red Bull situation time and time again and sounded increasingly confused and frustrated over what more he's supposed to do to be taken seriously. In fact, the Qatar weekend started with Tsunoda asking journalists to interview Red Bull and ask them if he was in the mix. That was because he didn't know if he genuinely is or not, and he even indicated he wouldn't believe what was said publicly anyway. Well, we actually took the opportunity to do exactly what Yuki requested. We asked Horner if he's in the mix, and Horner said, "Speed-wise, we can see he's fast. He's experienced now, he's making less mistakes. Everything is taken into account in any driver decision, we'll weigh it all up after the season. The priority is to understand what the path is with Sergio, and of course, what you have to remember is the pressure of being Max's teammate is probably the hardest job in Formula 1. You might think after hearing that or reading the quotes, why not just put Tsunoda in the car if he's got all that going for him? Well, first there's the stuff Horner didn't say. He didn't want to mention the reasons against Tsunoda's candidacy, but that relates to the final line about the pressure of being alongside Verstappen. That's where the Red Bull doubt can be inferred. It doesn't believe that Tsunoda is capable of doing his best job alongside Verstappen. There are concerns that he has made mistakes under pressure and lost his cool over the radio too often, even now when it's been made clear to him that this needs to be improved. Another suggestion is that his technical feedback is not the strongest, as this was supposedly exposed a little alongside Ricciardo when he was back in the second team. The bottom line is that speed is not the problem for Tsunoda, it's other stuff. Red Bull believes the upsides won't be worth the downsides, whether that is him spiralling at some point, crashing the car, underperforming, or whatever. Unfortunately for Tsunoda, that means despite doing a consistently good job and deserving a chance to show one way or another if he can hack it in that team, he's almost certainly not going to get it. The left field option that Red Bull was evaluating is currently driving for Williams, but he has faded from view. Franco Colapinto would require a big payout to extract him from his long-term Williams contract, and while there is clearly a lot of raw ability and speed there, and a lot of confidence, he has now had as many forgettable weekends as good ones in his cameo. Red Bull was very impressed by the job Colapinto did in the first few races after stepping in for Logan Sargent. The speed that he showed relative to Alex Albon and the fact that he was so unfazed by the challenge belied his inexperience in F1 and on some of the tracks he was racing on. He had a bit of swagger, a sense of personality, and a lot of commercial interest and national interest around him that inevitably attracted a lot of attention. So much so that he was even understood to have had terms agreed for a Red Bull deal if he kept hitting certain performance parameters, which we understand in broad terms to mean match or beat Albon. Unfortunately, it's not gone well since Brazil, which is where we understand things really unravelled. He crashed in the wet qualifying session there, then again in the race under the safety car. Crashing again in Las Vegas qualifying seems to have cemented Red Bull's view that Colapinto would be too big a risk. The same reason is why Colapinto had briefly been on Alpine's radar as well, but that interest has cooled too. At best, he could still be in the second Red Bull team next season if Lawson replaces Perez, but Red Bull's Formula 2 driver Isaac Hadjar is now the leading candidate there. And it will need a big swing in Colapinto's favour in Abu Dhabi, like him really impressing against Albon and Hadjar doing a bad job in Verstappen's Red Bull in Friday practice, then screwing up his F2 title decider. Hadjar worried Red Bull because his Silverstone FP1 outing earlier this year was weak. There was a concern about his composure and capacity to deal with how much goes on in an F1 car, but this has potentially faded. And if Hadjar wins F2 or is even just a strong second, it would look terrible for Red Bull to spurn that to take a junior from elsewhere. That is not something that Red Bull HQ was keen on doing, although if tens of millions suddenly appear from Argentina, maybe that would change things. Where it leaves Colapinto is staring at a year on the sidelines with Williams as a reserve driver with old car testing opportunities and maybe a racing program outside F1. That is a decent enough position to be in, but it would still be disappointing, having come so close to taking advantage of the Red Bull confusion to land a full-time F1 seat.